So, welcome to Lead Integrity's conversation series on leadership, competence, and integrity in today's times. We have a remarkable privilege of having some very prominent faith leaders in the United States landscape, political and religious landscape, who are joining us today to discuss building a beloved community, and most specifically to discuss Reverend Adam Taylor's seminal book on this issue. It is a very complicated and complex time in the world. It certainly is also a very complicated and complex time here in the United States of America. As we've noted in our original invitation to participants, what happens in the United States doesn't quite limit itself to the United States, but invariably impacts and obviously is impacted by the rest of the world. Today, we are undergoing a historic moment in so many senses. We've just completed the United Nations General Assembly, where a pact and a summit for the future took place with many interesting positions taken by various member states, but there seems to be a general sense of hope from some quarters and another sense of despair from others. But most critically, I think this is a country in a moment in time when we have a very important election, a presidential election, due to take place in a few weeks' time, literally. And for the first time, we have someone running for the presidency who is not only a woman, but also a woman with African and Asian lineage, and a very powerful position and history and work at that. So for many, many reasons, although in many other parts of the world, many women have come to power, but in the United States, this is a seminal moment. We have many conflicts going on around the world. With tremendous loss of life. There are those who argue that these conflicts are actually quite preventable and should have been prevented by the existing political, national and international infrastructure that we have. So all in all, many, many interesting times. These are perhaps the worst of times. These are the best of times, as we've all heard from different noteworthy corners. For the sake of today's conversation, I'm going to just not spend time on introducing the speakers. The flyer that went out had their biography as they wished to be known, but I also welcome that they may wish to say a few words about themselves as they engage in conversation with one another. The format that the speakers have kindly consented to is yes, and we have Dr. Hussein Rashid joining, which is brilliant. So I can now be moderator and I don't have to be the Muslim person speaking in this space, although I dare say that will be hard to avoid. But having said that, welcome Dr. Hussein Rashid, and welcome obviously to the keynote speaker, Reverend Adam Taylor, and welcome to Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, who are the main conversational centerpieces. I welcome also the participants who are there. I know that a number of people have sent in some last minute apologies, but this will be recorded. This is being recorded so that we can share your conversation and wisdom with those who could not join us today. We have agreed, thank you to Reverend Taylor, that he will begin by sharing some of the main tenets of his seminal book on building the beloved community, and perhaps also be able to relate aspects of this book, which already came up a couple of years ago, to the current dynamics that we are living today, so that Reverend Adam, you can bring Dr. Hussein and Joseph and Rabbi Joe on the same sort of conversational level so that you can start engaging with one another. This was labeled an interfaith conversation, and it was gently pointed out to me that actually this is an Abrahamic conversation at best, because we don't have any other prominent faith traditions involved. So I don't know, Reverend Taylor, depending on how you feel after this one, we might have to do a sequel with other faith leaders present. But for now, we're delighted to be able to have our rabbi and our chaplain together with us here. So, without further ado, I'm very grateful for making the time to be with us. And if you're okay, Reverend Adam Taylor, with starting us off, share a few aspects of your book, which dealt with so much of what is going on around us, most specifically the toxic polarization. I understand you have a wonderful foreword that was written by John Lewis, actually, very shortly before he passed. You speak about distrust for one another that is, and even contempt for one another that you noticed in the American context, which we all know is actually not limited to the American context. But for now, let's hear you, Reverend Taylor, in terms of what are the main arguments you're making in your book that relate to the here and now. And then we will invite our other speakers as well. So thank you. And the floor is yours, Reverend Taylor.
Thank you, Dr. Zakram. Thank you for this invitation. It's so good to be back together in this setting, and certainly remember so much work we did together when I was at the World Bank and you were at the United Nations. Grateful to be with these esteemed colleagues and really excited to hear some of your reflections, particularly coming from your own faith tradition. Let me start by sharing a little bit about my own story and a little bit why I wrote this book. So the full title of the book is A More Perfect Union, A New Vision for Building the Beloved Community. I grew up very much in the kind of shadow of the civil rights struggle. My mother, who's African American, and my father, who's white, made the controversial decision to get married to each other in 1968, just a year after interracial marriage was legalized in this country. And they instilled in me two really strong beliefs. The first was that my generation, Generation X, inherited the unfinished business of the civil rights struggle. And I really took that to heart. I kind of internalized that understanding, that responsibility, and became really mesmerized by the history of the civil rights struggle. I used to kind of think that I was born in the wrong era, that I should have been born to be at the height of the civil rights movement and be a student in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Though, I now feel like, no, God had a reason for me to be born in this particular era, and we'll talk more about maybe some of those reasons. But the other kind of core conviction they instilled in me is this really strong sense of Imago Dei, that we are all made in the very image and likeness of God. Genesis 1:27, it's actually a core belief that unites the Abrahamic faith traditions. And by virtue of that, kind of my diversity as a biracial person who identifies as being Black is a source of strength and not a weakness. And in a broader sense, our nation's diversity, its growing racial, ethnic, religious diversity, is a core strength, an asset, and not a liability. I even like to refer to it as our nation's superpower. I'm a big Marvel fan, and actually my dog is named Marvel, so you might hear some Marvel references over the course of this conversation today. And so as I was kind of approaching, as we were all approaching the 2016 election, I really felt that it was kind of a inflection point for our country. And I was watching with a great deal of alarm then candidate Trump stoke what I consider some of the worst kind of impulses and parts of our nation's history. And I'm really not here to be partisan. I'm going to try to, share my truth as I see it. But I wasn't concerned about his candidacy because he was a Republican or more conservative than I am. I was really concerned because I feel like he was able to stoke a lot of grievance and a lot of fear in the country, in part because of some of the economic challenges we've been facing, but also because of some of the demographic shifts that were happening that were becoming much more publicized at that point. Some of you may remember that the Census Bureau started to put out statistics that said that within about 30 years, by the year 2050, the United States of America would be a nation in which people of color would be in the majority and white Americans would be in the minority. Now, you could hear that statistic and see it as a source of pride and a source of hope, or you could see it as a real source of trepidation and a source of kind of losing your sense of control and power. And so, as we got closer and closer to the election, I, was kind of feeling this anguish. And I was feeling the anguish also because a lot of my professional life has been in the context of activism and advocacy. I've been trained in organizing, and I've really come to understand the power of stories. We are often an amalgamation of the stories that we've been told and the stories that we identify with. And that's true of us as people, but it's also true of us as communities and even as a nation. And I really believe that there is power in how we tell narratives about ourselves and about our future. And one of the things that felt missing leading into that 2016 election was kind of a moral vision that could be unifying, that could be inclusive, that could kind of help propel us on this journey of becoming a more just and inclusive, multiracial, multi-religious democracy. And instead, we had a very, very powerful, compelling moral vision that was kind of tied into the Make America Great Again slogan, which was a fairly ahistorical and dystopian vision, but a very, very powerful one and a very appealing one. But there wasn't a strong moral vision to counteract that. And so as I reflected on kind of my own life and what has inspired me the most, I kept coming back to the very vision that animated the civil rights struggle, which is the vision of the beloved community. The beloved community, for those that are less familiar with the term and the concept, was really first coined by Josiah Royce in 1915. He was one of the leaders of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Later, Dr. Martin Luther King became a member of that same fellowship. And he kind of coined the term beloved community, but it was really Dr. King who helped popularize it and make it much more well known. And Dr. King understood that the beloved community was a commitment to equality, a commitment to nonviolence, a commitment to what he called agape love, a kind of unconditional, selfless love. And he would constantly reference the beloved community, as would many other civil rights leaders. Some that you may not have heard of as much, people like Bob Moses and Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and so many others. And so I felt like this was a critical moment where we needed or had an opportunity to reimagine and recast the beloved community vision and contemporize it for our current moment. And I thought that was particularly important because we were dealing with a form of polarization that had increasingly become toxic. Dr. Azza mentioned this a little bit, but just to put a finer point on this, Pew around 2016 started through their polling to show that not only do the majority of Democrats and Republicans distrust each other, which is, not a good place to be as a country, but we had passed this threshold where the majority of Democrats and Republicans now reported that they have contempt for people of the other party. And instead of wanting to simply try to persuade them, they now just wanted to defeat them. And that is a pretty dangerous place to be as a country. It is a place that opens the door not only for the potential for political violence, but opens the door for kind of conflict entrepreneurs and even authoritarian leaders to be able to push their agenda through. And so, I kind of wrote the book as a way to provide a moral vision that I thought could be a unifying one. And I just want to, close kind of my intro by sharing my own kind of succinct definition of what the beloved community is all about. So I really try to ground this vision both in our civic values, particularly in the context of the United States of trying to achieve liberty and justice for all, and in our deepest held religious values. And I ground it in my own Christian faith. But one of the things I love about the beloved community is I believe that it resonates and it shows up in other faith traditions. And I certainly want to hear my esteemed colleagues to share a little bit about how they think it shows up. I reflect a little bit on what I've been able to learn from Islam and from Judaism and even from Buddhism and Hinduism in that context. But my kind of most succinct definition is building the beloved community is basically becoming a nation, but you can also apply this to the world at large, where neither punishment nor privilege is tied to our race, our ethnicity, our ableness, our gender, our religion, our sexual orientation. It is creating a society where everyone is equally valued, where our diversity is seen as a strength and not a weakness, and where everyone is able to thrive. And I know that that can sound very lofty. In some ways, it's meant to be very aspirational. But, I earned a degree in public policy. So there's a part of me that is very pragmatic and wants to measure things. And we can actually measure whether a political decision or a budget or a policy either helps to reinforce the ways in which privilege and punishment are so often tied to core parts of our identity, or whether it actually helps to dismantle that and ensure that that is no longer the reality that we face in our society and in our nation. And so I think that that part is really measurable, as is, how we can measure thriving and flourishing. And so that's kind of my succinct definition, but then I thought it was really important to unpack what that actually looks like. And so I describe what I call 6 Beatitudes, very much drawing on the Sermon on the Mount, drawing from my own faith tradition. These are the kind of core principles, the core commitments that I think we need to realize the beloved community. So they include a commitment to Imago Dei equality. They include a commitment to Ubuntu interdependence. They include a commitment to radical welcome, to environmental stewardship, to nonviolence, and to dignity for all. And I'm happy to go into more detail, but for the sake of time, I won't kind of unpack each of those. But I guess what I want to end with is that when I wrote the book, maybe in some ways I was somewhat naive, because I actually felt that the book came out and I finished writing it just as we were, finishing the 2020 election. And I was able to make a couple of kind of last minute additions as we knew what the election outcome was. And actually, even after January 6th, and we just saw the horrific insurrection at the nation's capital. And I thought that that moment was going to be the kind of breaking of the fever, that we could now see more possibilities to not only reduce the toxic polarization in our society, but also be able to move away from a politics of fear and of grievance and of zero sum and us versus them thinking. And sadly, I think rather than seeing that weaken, we have actually seen it strengthen. And we have seen, candidate Trump, as he runs for a second presidential term, double down on many of the same vices that I was so concerned about the first time around. And so, whereas in the past, I would have described the core choice in front of us as a choice between choosing the beloved community and choosing kind of a path of toxic polarization, I think now the choice is even more stark, particularly in the context of election. I think this election increasingly is a real choice between whether we are going to truly push our nation down the track of becoming a more inclusive, just democracy, or are we going to slide down the path of a more racialized autocracy, let alone authoritarian type government? And, I'm not trying to be alarmist, but based on what candidate Trump has done in the past, let alone what he's promised to do, I think that threat is extremely real. And so again, like I work in a nonpartisan organization, I'm doing a lot of nonpartisan work to ensure every single voter can vote in this election and that every vote is counted and that we can prevent political violence. I have to be kind of, consistent with my call to the prophetic tradition to really try to speak truthfully about the choices in front of us and some of the risks that we see. And so I'll just end with this. The beloved community is not just a destination, it is also a journey. And in that journey, I really believe and have experienced that we can encounter and experience a greater sense of not only unity, but of a sense of joy, of a deeper sense of community that I think is also desperately longed for in a time in which so many Americans and people beyond America are feeling really isolated, are feeling oftentimes very angry, are feeling in some cases very much betrayed. And so this kind of yearning for belonging, for deeper connection is also a critical way that the beloved community can be a real antidote. So let me stop there. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much indeed, Reverend Taylor. And I think you've set up some of the key issues really, really well. Before I give the floor to Rabbi Potasnik and Dr. Hussein, I do need to ask you one question to give you a chance to just elaborate a bit more on the aspect of the present day. What another feature of the polarization that we're seeing today, you're right about obviously what's being said by the candidates and so on and the different positions. And you've noted that there's that the choice that we are confronted with today is even more stark. I'm particularly curious about where the wars in different parts of the world, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, whether it's Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, that's a civil conflict, whether it's, the Israel and Gaza, now Israel, Lebanon, how those wars are also causing remarkable ripples of polarization here in the United States. And how do we, if you will, how do we go about then in your understanding and in your own advocacy and work, how do we go about building the beloved community given those added external dynamics that are very much impacting on the internal? Just a few thoughts on that, please. And I'm not expecting you to give the answers, but just to perhaps deepen a little bit some of your context as you've shared it so brilliantly.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, it's a really important question. And in the commitment to nonviolence, there's really embedded within that a commitment to peacemaking. In my faith tradition, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. And so I think that's really important. I think one of the things that we need to develop more of is the ability to listen more deeply and to show empathy with those that we may have very strong disagreements with, and ultimately engage in hard conversations about even the most sensitive issues without demonizing or dehumanizing those we disagree with. And so I'm saying that because in part in the context of the aftermath of October 7th, which was just heartbreaking and was a horrific massacre, we also, obviously seen all of the humanitarian crisis and the really, in my eyes, unconscionable loss of life in Gaza and beyond. And it feels like there are ways in which the polarization in our politics has really crippled our ability to try to find some common ground on some of the kind of policy, I don't know, solutions, but policies that I actually think the majority of people could come together around. And so, particularly in this moment, a kind of call for a ceasefire is one that actually the majority of Americans support. But of course, that ceasefire needs to be tied to the release of hostages, and it needs to be tied to a longer term vision for peace and security in the area, in the region. And so, there's a lot, obviously, we can unpack with that particular crisis and conflict. But, I've seen kind of a hardening of position and a lot of kind of talking past one another. And one of the things that's really been challenging and kind of heartbreaking for me is that there's been longstanding alliances between Jewish leaders and African American leaders and others, particularly in the context of promoting civil rights and trying to protect and strengthen our democracy. And I think everything that's happened in the aftermath of October 7th has really tested and stretched a lot of those relationships and those bonds. Fortunately, many of them have remained in place, but I think it's also kind of crippled some of those relationships. And that really pains me, because I think this is a moment where we need the strongest, boldest multiracial movement that is committed to not only protecting our democracy, but ultimately help, trying to transform it.
Thank you so much. That was not an easy question, and I'm grateful for your forbearance, but also for the way that you've tackled it. And you did mention how even amongst the faith communities and faith leaders, there is a break, so to speak. And I think this, in a sense, is important to segue to Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, I refer to him as my rabbi because I've had lots of conversations with him in which he was extremely enlightening. And I think that it's been a difficult time, has it not, Rabbi Joe? And what are some of your reflections on what Adam has shared, please?
Thank you both. Dr. Karam, I tell people that being a rabbi is my full-time position. Everything else is secondary. Reverend Taylor, I'm sorry that we're having this conversation, because it demonstrates that we in the faith world and those who preceded us have failed. Because as I recall years ago, attending a service in a Baptist church, which was a Quaker church, was conducted completely in silence. I said to one of the people there, "When does the service begin?" And he said, sir, the service also continues when you walk outside. What you do outside determines how sincere you were inside. And we've been talking about a beloved community for a long time in our traditions. The word kihila in Hebrew means community. And in the word kihila is the word voice. And it's a place where everybody has a voice, not one voice out shouting others, but where everybody has a voice. Years ago, when Dr. King had the March on Washington, he was preceded by Dr. Joachim Prince, a rabbi. And Dr. Prince was a survivor of the Holocaust. And Prince said one of the lessons of the Holocaust was that we were silent when we should have shouted. And I think one of the reasons that we are where we are today, not where we should be today, is that we shouted maybe on the inside of our sanctuaries, but not enough on the outside of our sanctuaries. That we spoke of all the lofty ideals inside, but we didn't speak enough about them outside. I was reading a story just before I came on this call, just a coincidental, I was reading the story about a young boy walking with his father, and they saw somebody selling balloons. And dad says, son, I want to buy you a balloon. Which one do you want? The son says, Dad, which one flies higher? The white one, the green one, the blue one? And the father said, son, I want you to remember something. It doesn't matter what the color is on the outside. It's what you have on the inside. We've been saying that for a long time. And yet the world seems to put us, whether it's colors or groups, pitting one against the other, but certainly not the concept of community. So I think we have, the prophetic voice needs to be heard in a much more aggressive fashion. And someone said, when there's peace amongst the religions, there'll be peace in the world. I think when we really are much louder together and echoing one another, and when we disagree, demonstrating disagreement without denigration, disagreement with respect. You showed us how it's either or. And I can tell you, in Jewish tradition, when you look at the Talmud, it's both can be right. And I'd like to think that there are times when both can be right. And when one is wrong, or both are wrong, we're able to point it out in a civilized way so that we model for our kids how to speak to one another. Just let me conclude. I read an article recently, and in it, it was said that a group of parents were lecturing their kids about some of the foul language they use. And one of the kids said, wait a minute, Dad, do you hear what you say? Do you hear what you speak? So if we don't become the role models in decency, how do we expect more of our kids? So we have much more to do, and look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Joe. I think you've highlighted a number of different and critical points, and I think you've underlined something that Reverend Taylor has spoken about rather well, which is it's not so much whether we disagree with one another, but it's how we disagree without demeaning and denigrating the other. And thank you for bringing out.
Yeah, if I could just add one more point.
Absolutely.
Going quick. When I say either or, someone asked me recently, are you pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian? And I said very simply, you can be both. You can be both. And I think we've lost that concept of seeing, the wrongs in either side and how we need to be both sometimes.
Brilliant. This is a great moment to invite the intervention of Dr. Hussein Rashid, who I think, Dr. Hussein, you've heard brilliantly. What are some of your own takes, if you will, on what you've heard from Reverend Taylor and from Rabbi Joseph Potasnik? Please go ahead.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you for having me here. Adam, I have to say I'm a little bit disappointed. You'd promised me Marvel references, and I have yet to hear one beyond the dog. And I was hoping for the power of storytelling and narrative here. But I am a Gen X kid myself. So I understand. I feel I'm not biracial. I'm of South Asian descent via East Africa. I grew up in ways that made me acutely conscious of race in this country. grew up in New York, and I feel that shadow of the civil rights movement, perhaps not as an inheritor, but as somebody who understands what was at stake and what remains at stake, right? I think it is the unrealized, the unfulfilled dream. And I think that as I hear you speak about what is so important and your beatitudes, your six beatitudes, I'm deeply touched. I think this is something, a conversation I've had with many of my Christian colleagues about Imago Dei, that, Muslims, or at least my understanding of Islam, my community of Muslims, doesn't have that same conception because God has no form. We have the spirit of God, literally the ruh, meaning both breath and soul of God. But then I think, what is the image of God? It's not actually meant to be literal. So what is that spirit? Is the spirit of compassion and mercy. And how do we make that then manifest within the world? And how do we have compassion and mercy? How do we become peace builders with compassion and mercy? And here I think I turn to the Quran again, because you cannot do this without justice, right? There are 2 points in the Quran, and I'm going to collapse the two of them for the sake of simplicity. But where it says you must stand for justice. You have to stand for justice against those in authority and power. Don't fear them, fear God, right? Because that's where true power lies. Stand for justice against your family, stand for justice against yourself, because you too will be unjust. And that the idea that to generate a lasting, meaningful peace cannot happen absent justice. And I think for me, I want to give credit to Reverend Kelly Brown Douglas, who I heard give a talk about 4 or 5 months ago, and she was talking about this moment where Jesus is talking about the first shall be last and the last shall be first uh, at sort of at the end times. And I've always understood it, and I think most people I know understand it as an inversion of power, right? That those who are first will be the last to enter heaven. Those who are the least amongst us now will be the first to enter heaven. We'll have that proximity to the divine. And what Dr. Douglas did that has so, I think, resonates with me so deeply is she says that this is not an inversion of power. This is circularity. Who becomes the first, who becomes the last? In the ideals community, and I'm going to use your language of the beloved community, is who do we then determine who's first, who is last? Because the idea is that we are at a point of equality, because that's the point where we've hit true justice. As you talk about not determining or not classifying, not marginalizing people on questions of race, on class, on ability, on gender, on sexuality. I think yes to all that you said, and that's what true justice is. So how do we achieve justice? And here, I think your point on dignity for all really resonates for me, because we have been asked explicitly about what is happening right now in Palestine. I think that it pains me what happened to Israelis on October 7th. I know many people who had family members who were taken hostage, some of whom have lost their family members, and that pains me. In the same way that it pains me what is happening in Palestine for the last year, in the same way that it pains me what has been happening in Lebanon for the last week, right? And that to stand for justice is to recognize that these are affronts to human dignity, and that I can recognize the pain that is caused by the hostage taking and wanting the hostages to be returned, and recognizing that standing for justice also means we have to name the agents behind the destruction we're seeing now. And this is, and I've said this publicly before, the Netanyahu government has had a standing policy of 50 dead brown people for every Israeli killed. We haven't hit that number yet, right? And I do not expect this to end until we see 50,000 dead Arabs. And this is the reality. If we do not call that out, we cannot take a stand for justice. That does not mean I wish harms on the hostages. That does not mean I wish to see the destruction of Israel, but it means that there is something happening in Gaza right now. There is something happening in Lebanon right now that has to be named. And I think what I fear is that sometimes in the politeness of our interfaith interactions, in the politeness of wanting peace, we forget justice in this exchange. And that to me is trying to understand, how do we fit justice in a way that because we have built these strong, deep, abiding bonds prior to moments of crisis, that we can then talk justice even if we don't agree necessarily on the methods and systems of how to achieve that justice. And I really want to pull that out as something I invest in. There's one thing I have to say. I apologize. I was a little bit late joining. I'm not sure how I was introduced, but I am not speaking in any official capacity for any organization for which I'm affiliated. I need to be very clear about that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hussein. Actually, we didn't introduce the speakers, and I said the flyer that went out had the bios of our speakers. I wanted to give you all more time to actually talk, and you're very welcome to say something about yourselves, which I think you've all done in different ways. So thank you for that clarification. What happens, and just bear with me before I ask Reverend Adam Taylor to share some more reflections based on what he's heard, but one question, Dr. Hussein, is there's always been this, the narrative of justice is a narrative and a counter narrative at the same time, and elicits a counter narrative. One person's justice or one community's justice may be another community's injustice. And so given that I happen to agree, by the way, but just to make sure that we are all clear, including on where we don't agree, but the issue here is, how do we achieve justice if it appears to be or is seen as injustice for another community? And I will come back to Reverend Adam Taylor and Rabbi Joseph Potasnik with the same question, but since you posed it, I just want to give you the opportunity to elaborate this point. Thank you.
Thank you also. I really appreciate that. And that's why I tried to preface, I think, with Adam's point on human dignity, right? I think that any justice that is dependent on marginalizing, oppressing another people, right, regardless of whatever narratives led us to that point, is not in fact justice. It is marginalization and oppression. Anything that denies other people's human dignity is an affront to conceptions of justice, is a hindrance to peace, right? So when we think about peace building, how do we uplift human dignity? How do we elevate the value of humanity? How do we recognize that we are created in the image of God, whether that is from more literal to more metaphorical readings, but that we are bound together? And again, I come back to the Quran, that this is not just human to human relationships, right? But that all of God's creation is around us. The Quran repeatedly tells us, all around you are ayats, all around you are signs of God's presence in the world. And those presence is not only human to human relationship, but it is in the flowers, it is in the animals. And that sense of a shared creator, that sense of a shared being, and here I'm going to go maybe leave Marvel and go to Star Wars, but a shared force animating us, right? But that ties us together and connects us in a meaningful way, is something we have to take very, very seriously. And I will point out, I don't want to mention names of individuals because I don't necessarily know if I have their permissions, but I've been doing interfaith work for very many years. I know Joe through that world, although not in the depth of some of the other people whom I've worked with. And when October 7th happened, and I did my check-ins, I was like, how are you doing? And what do we do next? Some people wrote back to me right away and were like, I am broken and I need space. Some people totally ghosted me. I literally did not hear from them 8 or 9 months before they wrote back to me and said, I didn't know how I could feel and interact with somebody whom I know believes, I believe that Palestine should be free. And I've said this for decades of my life. And he was like, when it's in theory, it's a discussion point. When it's in practice, I don't know what that means. But we had the relationship that he needed that time to ghost me for 8 months to then be able to have that conversation. Other people I go around, I've been on the circuit with, right? And I think this sense of recognizing each other's humanity and recognize that we both want what is best, not for my people and your people, but for all people, that's how we get to justice. The second it's yours and mine, I don't know if we're having a conversation about justice so much as we are thinking about winning an argument or achieving some other aim. I think when it's about what do we do for people, that's when we start elevating the human condition.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussein. Reverend Adam, what are some of your reflections based on what you've heard? Anything you would care to share?
Yeah, well, I appreciate both Rabbi Potesnik and Dr. Hussein's reflections. And I'll just start where Dr. Hussein left off with this kind of emphasis on human dignity. We know that human dignity is really at the core of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It is at the core of the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. Unfortunately, it's an agenda that most Americans have never heard of. It is a very comprehensive, inspiring agenda to try to end extreme poverty by the year 2030, and also, focuses on sustainable development and much, much more. So I do think that's kind of anchoring a commitment to human dignity is a thread that I think is a really powerful one that can unite us in the context of, almost like a North Star that can guide how we work together to achieve justice. One of my reflections is, and I do, talk about this pretty extensively in the book, is that sadly, at least within the Christian community, and I'd be curious if this happens in a similar way with some of the Muslim community and the Jewish community, justice gets reduced to charity. And it's not to say that charity is not important. I think that is one component of how we achieve justice. But at least my understanding of biblical justice, both from the Old Testament and from a New Testament perspective, is that achieving justice requires us to address and to, ultimately rectify the root causes that so often cause and perpetuate injustice itself. And there are kind of four forms of injustice that show up in different combinations that are often those root causes. They include different forms of domination, different forms of violence and the threat of violence. They include exploitation, particularly economic exploitation, but that could also include other forms of exploitation. Certainly, the most extreme form, slavery or bonded labor, etc. And they include various ways of excluding people from community and essentially, marginalizing them. And what I have seen, particularly just apply this to the US context, is that within many parts of the Christian community, particularly the more conservative Christian community, there's been a real denial and unwillingness, a kind of blindness to addressing root causes. So even after all that we saw in the summer of 2020 with the horrific, killing, murder of George Floyd and the killing of so many other Black men and women, when you kind of polled white evangelicals in particular, they basically would say that they were certainly dismayed and concerned, but really didn't think that there was a systemic problem with policing in America. They, would say that it's just a couple of bad apples, but there's really, no systemic problem. And I think that is tied in part to an overly individualistic theology and a theology that overemphasizes kind of acts of charity and doesn't kind of help us understand that there is really structural evil, there's structural injustice that does need to be addressed. And that, we fundamentally do have a problem with policing from my perspective in this country. And there's certainly statistics that back that up, but also the real lived experiences of myself and so many others. So I'm just using that as one illustration. The last thing I'll just say in the context of how we create change is that for so many kind of causes of justice, no amount of charity is going to be the solution. So let's go back to the civil rights example. No amount of charity was going to dismantle the system of Jim Crow segregation in the South. That literally required a movement that created the political will to change the law of the land and pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And in a similar way, many of the forms of injustice that we see in our midst today do require real shifts in policy and law, and of course in attitudes as well. And so I think we have to kind of push ourselves to kind of go deeper and to really understand that a commitment to justice does require addressing those root causes. And for me, kind of, again, my more succinct definition of what justice is it's restoring right relationship between ourselves and God, ourselves and our neighbors, and particularly ourselves and those that we deem the other, and ourselves in all creation. And of course, right relationship then has to be unpacked, but I think that is kind of at the core of what we're trying to do together as we advance a vision for justice.
Thank you very much, Reverend Adam. And I think, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to start preparing for the next question, and which will be my last question to you before we open it up, which is, what would you write differently, if anything, after these, in the last few years, the developments, and also when you've had an opportunity to discuss and engage with other faiths in this context? But one of the things that you've mentioned that I think bears more elaboration is, on the one hand, I think we all agree that there's systemic injustice, and I think that's part of the problem. You've positioned it in the context of policing and certain systems, but we also, those of us who have been engaged in international foreign affairs, foreign policy, international peace building, we know that there's also systemic injustice within foreign affairs dynamics and relations, and how certain governments will or will not come to the aid of others regardless of what they do, that can sometimes actually be against international law. So we know that there's systemic injustice even in these kinds of contexts. And so how, on the one hand, do you deal with systemic injustice and yet at the same time restore those interpersonal relationships based on dignity? Because it seems to me that one is systems and the other is the relational dynamic. And I'm going to come back to you on this, but I just want to hear a bit from Rabbi Joseph and from Dr. Hussein also on some of the things you've raised and that question. So if you don't mind, allow me to engage Rabbi Joseph on this and on what he's heard so far.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I just want to say thank you, Dr. Azza, because I always find that interfaith conversations are predicated on interfaith, that if we don't have a strong sense of who we are, it's hard to have a meaningful conversation with others of different faiths. And the word justice is so important to us that when you look at the Hebrew tradition, the Hebrew Bible, it's mentioned twice in one sentence. It says, justice, justice, thou shalt pursue. And the question becomes, why did they just say justice once? Why twice? Because it's not just about charity. With the word for charity is tzedakah. This is about having profound respect for the other who is a member of the human family. When it says love your neighbor, it doesn't say love your Christian neighbor, Jewish neighbor, love your neighbor, because we all belong to that human family. So I think when Jews and African Americans stood together, and I was talking to someone who was the speechwriter in the Martin Luther King group. He was one of the speechwriters. He said to me that Dr. King said to him, the Jews have historically stood with us, and they stand with us now. And I was very proud to hear that, because to me, that was what the Bible's been preaching. So, you measure belief by behavior. People can say all of these pronouncements, but they don't perform, then it's just a hollow message. So that's for justice. Look, Dr. Hussein, who I value very much, he and I can have a different perspective on what's happening now in Gaza, on what's happening in Iran, what's happening in Lebanon. I wish we would use a larger lens to look at this and say, how did we get to this point? Why are we having this discussion? This is something that should have been addressed years ago. Why is it that we have people who are committed to our destruction and proudly can say it, that I'm here to kill you and I'm proud of that, and they can get away with it? Elie Wiesel said the tragedy of the Holocaust was that you could get away with it. So I think we need to look at that and not just look at the immediate, but look at the historic kind of projection that has taken place. But I do feel that when we pray, when we proclaim with our prophetic voice, that we find every member. I don't know of any tradition that proclaims the devaluation of the other. I've never come across it. As a matter of fact, Cardinal Dolan said to me, anti-Semitism is anti-Christianity, is anti-Islam. I've heard a Muslim proverb that says, God made one blood of the human family, right? So I think all of us say basically the same thing in terms of, that the challenge becomes, how do we take that and have that taken seriously by those in positions of authority? And that's where we have an obligation to be relentless in speaking out, speaking strongly, and not just saying, one and done. So I would hope we continue not just the conversation, but continue the demonstrations. John Lewis, who was mentioned earlier, was a great exemplar of what it was to protest in a constructive way. It wasn't just the protest. It's what happened the day after the protest, and he was in the halls of Congress pounding on the table and reminding people we have a responsibility, a moral responsibility, to make sure that everyone retains that dignity and that decency. And I also think here we are approaching the High Holy Days in Jewish tradition, and we pray for not a happy, say Happy New Year. We don't pray for happy. We pray for a good year in which we seek to make it better. So I would hope it's a good year, but I hope it's a year in which we improve upon where we've been. As somebody said years ago in the civil rights struggle, we're not where we want to be. Thank God we're not where we used to be. No, we're not where we used to be. We're not where we should be, but thank God we're going to be in a better place. And I think if we keep looking at where we need to be, that will happen, but only if we work together. And I think this is a wonderful start.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Joe. Dr. Hussein.
I'm going to pick up on something Joe said, which is the word for charity. It's sadaqah in Hebrew, and in Arabic, the cognate. It's actually a cognate word. It's sadaqah, and it means. It doesn't mean charity. Charity is a very particular Christian notion of giving, and whether it's structural giving and meant for structural transformation. At least in Arabic, the sense that it has is of giving, which is different than charity, but it has a semantic range of friendship, truth, and community. That it is the idea that you give with the idea of building community, of building relationship, of finding truth, and whether that truth is in relationship to each other, the idea that the reason something needs to be given is because something is fundamentally broken structurally in our social effort, and that giving reveals that truth of what is broken. A friend of mine, Rabbi Joe Jacobs, wrote a book on this notion in Jewish traditions called "There Shall Be No Needy," and I keep thinking about that because the Quran talks about that when you give, this comes up in a couple of places, but you give to people who are needy and people who are beggars. And beggars, the way it's usually understood is that the needy are in a transient state of being in need, right? This is the person who needs that 20 to close that bill, which does speak to a structural issue. But the needy are the people we as society have failed structurally. And how do we get there? How do we address that? And the point is, Adam quotes the proverb, a couple of bad apples, right? But the whole thing is a couple of bad apples spoils the barrel, right? It's this idea that we've so become divorced from nature that we actually don't understand what it is we're saying, which is that when you have the least bit of rot, it's an indication of a deeper, more sustained, either existing rot or potential rot. And the only way you deal with that is getting rid of that rotten structure and rebuilding it, right? I have other thoughts on our international situation, but I'm mindful that we are here to talk about the beloved community, and I will turn to that. But thank you for that opportunity to reflect on giving and justice.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussein, and thank you especially for linking that within at least the Arabic terminology, the same word for sadaqah refers to friendships, refers to truth. And so it's the act of giving as you build together. So it brilliantly is captured in that one word. And thank you very much to Rabbi Potasnik for highlighting that criticality of looking, making sure that our sight is always on where we want to be, as opposed to only this moment, which can deepen the grief and the polarization, as many of you have heard. Reverend Taylor, just what would you have, if anything, wanted to write or rewrite or update or change, whatever. Now, as you look back at building the beloved community and looking at where we're at this moment in time, any thoughts on that before I ask our other colleagues to quickly share a few queries or comments?
Sure. Yeah, two thoughts. One is, I think I would love to offer, this would be an addition, more practical tools and tips on how to have more of those brave conversations with people that have very different points of view, ideologically, politically, et cetera, culturally. And, there's no like magic bullet for that, but I do think that we do have some tools, and, I've learned a lot more about that since I wrote the book. So maybe that could be, I don't know, maybe it's a sequel, I'm not sure. But the other thing that I really wrestled with, and I don't know entirely how to change this, because one of the things I really struggled with when I wrote the book is I felt like I had to remain true to my sense of call to be a truth teller.
Mm.
And in doing that, the book is pretty critical of the kind of MAGA movement and of former President Trump. And I struggle with that because I didn't want the book to just preach to the choir.
Mm.
And I didn't want to close the door on many people that might have voted for President Trump the first time, or might even want to vote for him a second time, to not be able to receive some of the messages in the book. And so that's a hard one, particularly in this very polarized moment that we're in, particularly politically, where it feels like there is such a strong kind of calcified base that is very, not just loyal to the former president, but it's almost like he can do no wrong. And, sometimes you can see that on the Democratic side, but I don't think it's anywhere to the same degree. And, if you kind of look at a lot of what I have written or what my organization does and says, we've been quite critical of the Biden administration on a number of things, wanting to go further or to do things differently. And of course, we have certainly been quite vocal in our deep concerns about the former president. So I guess that would be my one query in terms of, how to reach the broadest audience while still being really faithful to your sense of truth telling.
Thank you very much. And I think you've actually hit the nail on the head there with that hard one, because in a sense, this is precisely what you're advocating that we need to do, is to be able to have those brave conversations with those who have calcified in the differences from us, and who are different in terms of how they're thinking, and sometimes not very nice in the way that they engage with. So that's exactly what I think we're all struggling with. And how do you build a beloved community if you're not going to know how to work out those particular relational conversations that are absolutely necessary, because we don't exist in bubbles. I'm very respectful of the fact that we have Nelida with us from Rome, Italy. It is getting on rather late her time. Nelida, is there any comment or perspective that you wish to share from where you're at, especially since we know that in the European elections, a number of right-wing political parties have been elected and voted in different positions. So it's not just here in the United States that we're seeing calcified resentment, but we are seeing it reemerge and be prominent politically in different European countries. Any thoughts or reflections from your side, Nelida? And you are muted, my dear.
Okay. Thank you, Aza. Thank you to you all, because it was a joy and a deep reconciliation for me. Listen, you all, because I am Christian Catholic, very committed that, as Aza said, in the maybe Reverend, is a Catholic social teaching. So everything in order addressed to the common good. And only one point that I share with Aza since long time when we met, that it was just a gift for me, because I started to feel very alone in my church. Why? Because in front of a normal, simple experience, and I married recently an Anglican, And you know that I couldn't take communion in the Anglican Church according to my church. And this created a big shock, because for us the communion is so just to respect all the other leaders, I mean representatives of the other religions. I think that somebody mentioned we should focus the meaning about communion and brotherhood. And certainly for me, one of the big lack is a moral platform between normal human beings, because we see also in Italy, everywhere, what is going on. And I think that how to, something that I experienced it, despite I left my association with the Vatican, because I saw that sometimes we speak about something, but there is not a coherence. So we cannot speak about collaboration or dialogue when a word is not joined to a coherent act. And I believe strongly that we are at a turning point. Listening the last news, of course, is not a problem to be against the Jewish from Islam or vice versa. Is to discover altogether the brotherhood between us, because and personally, because I believe in God. God, despite all the division between religions, is God, is one. I hope that in this way we are closer to find a new development model. And just to finish, I have in front of me an image, our dream with Azza also I share with her, to create an initiative in Italy, just to have a look about this famous painting that is the common good, the Ambrogetti, and represent the different power, political power, moral drivers, and at the end that you never seen. I realized after many experiences and many visits in this museum, and there is a rope that unites everybody. So we will not win until we start from ourselves. We'll not be able to discover our simple rule, to respect and to collaborate. Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. No, I finished. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Nelida. Wise words indeed. I wish we had an image of that painting to show, but perhaps next time, inshallah. Just a quick point that I'm sorry we missed Danielle Perel from the Baha'i International Community, but we still have Ulfat, who's also in East Africa, and it's darn late her time too, and she would like to make an intervention. So Reverend Adam, Rabbi Potasnik, Dr. Hussein, if you can bear with me to please allow her to say what she needs to say, and then we will come to James Patton as well. So James, don't you dare go away, please stay. All right, Ulfat, please go ahead.
Oh, much thanks, Dr. Azza. Thank you for the wonderful speakers, for the neutral discussion. We didn't heat up, because most interfaith discussions, there's a moment where there's some heat. I'm just here listening to the story and of the book of the author and reflecting to the situation right now. If you go to the Abrahamic books and you go to the Quran, I can't quote the exact quotes, but they usually refer to this as it was prophesied. So I'm not so sure if it is prophecy or human beings taking advantage of the holy books and prophesizing it with their own hands. I come from an interfaith background. My father is Christian, my mother is Muslim, and a whole concoction of other mixture of religions in my family. Sometimes ourselves in this family, we go overboard when we discuss about religion and forget humanity. Like now people are dying. You're looking at systematic injustice. We can't look at the people who are dying. I don't know what is going on. It's like a horrific movie. But this is a war. This is a situation beyond books. This is a war and situation beyond religious text, beyond all narratives. This is vicious. It will go low today and arise again tomorrow, after a funny time of election time, politics time, and whole sort of view. So the humanity aspect, the humanity nature of human beings is no longer there. It's just about self-interest and creating a war to fight for I don't know what, resources, capitalism. It's like the war now is neo-colonization of this war. Like we're going back to the Jahiliyyah period where Arabs were Arabs before they became religious. So it's quite an intriguing discussion and quite a disappointing situation, but it is the fact of the day. We have lost it as religious. We don't have a description of this. This is just lack of humanity. That is my conclusion. Thank you, and back to you. And I beg to leave. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ulfat. And on that really high note, maybe just to hear from James, who's a veteran of being in conflict settings in different parts of the world, whether it's Colombia or trying to work out educational curricula in Saudi Arabia that are mitigating against certain fundamentalist perspectives. James, you have a very wide range of deep engagement and mediation in conflict settings, and you're a senior advisor now. You're the former executive director of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. I think you're the only one on this call who can potentially support Reverend Adam Taylor's sports teams in Washington. Others are perhaps more New York and internationally oriented. Some of your own, please, thoughts, reflections based on what you've heard from our distinguished speakers.
Well, thank you, Aza. And yeah, I mean, I grew up as a Red Sox fan on the Red Sox side of Connecticut, so I'm okay with Washington. We have to kind of go around New York on my way down here, though, so I have to make that clear. But I just want to thank the speakers for re-inspiring, I think is the right term, because I think we coast along in our obligations of the day, and that's more kind of linear and structured, and then we kind of get back to this question of principle, and it just relights the fire, I think, that's behind what we do. And so in the spirit of storytelling, if I might share something, you know, I'm a Quaker. We heard the Quakers mentioned. Thank you. Thanks for the shout out. And I get asked sometimes, because one of our principles is the rejection of external violence. And I get asked sometimes, people, you know, think they're clever. They're often friends, so you know they are a little clever. But they'll say to me, "What would you do if you're in a situation like the Boston Marathon bombing, and you had a weapon, and you knew that people were about to detonate these backpacks, and you could have shot them and stopped them?" As a Quaker who rejects violence, and I say, well, absolutely, I shoot them, I mean, without hesitation. But if I stop there, I've missed the point. The point is, the work is not in stopping or not stopping the shooting. The work is in fixing the circumstances that put someone in a position where they believed that that was okay. You know, to use Thich Nhat Hanh's concept of, you know, the Buddhist concept of codependent arising, he talks about interbeing. We inter-are together. And so one of the things that's made me think a lot about, and this kind of re-inspired it for me, is the idea that what if our enemy was the brokenness of relationship and not the other person or the other group? The actual brokenness is the enemy. It's poverty, not the rich or poor. It's oppression, not the oppressed or the oppressor. And so if we're fighting and trying to eliminate that harmful relationship or those risks or those brokennesses, then what it does for me is it turns principles into universalities rather than making them partisan. And this goes back to what we talked about a minute ago. I mean, I hear people talk about their pain and suffering as partisan principles. You know, Aza, you asked, what if So one person's justice is another person's injustice. Well, that's not justice, right? And that was the response. If your justice cannot be universally understood, then there's a flaw in it, right? And this goes back to this idea of kind of mutuality over, zero-sum interest. And there's a lot of philosophy and theory and social theory behind the idea that if everyone does well, I do better, and we could talk about that. But I just think that's a framing that I will work with, and I really love this: the first shall be last, and the last shall be first idea that's re-understood differently. I'd never heard that, and that is just such a great light bulb going off for me. And I love when scripture can be unpacked this way, that it's not about inversion. It's not about taking a system where one person was excluded or group and another one had privilege and flipping it so that the one who was oppressed is now the oppressor. You're still stuck with an unjust system. But if you create this circle where you can no longer distinguish between who does and doesn't have privilege, who is or isn't healthy and whole, who does or doesn't get represented by systems of justice, you can't distinguish, then you're approximating. And to go back to Adam's embrace of the phrase, the beloved community. So again, just really grateful for the kind of re-inspiration. I think I've just written the chapter of a book here while I was listening to you guys. So I'll make sure to mention you if I ever publish it in the acknowledgments. But as always, my gratitude to you for bringing together such an extraordinary conversational group. I'm just happy to be here. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. I think you should be given the title Reverend as an honorary title for yourself, James, because you've just put things in a very extraordinarily spiritual, but also deeply practical and pragmatic perspective. And I'm grateful to you for that. By the way, for those of you with us, just for you to know, Lead Integrity is women-led. It's not women-centered, and James is our first male partner in this effort. So talk about brave conversations. It's also brave beings, and James is one of them, and I think you all can see why. He has that incredibly valuable input and leadership to share and to guide us all on. Dr. Sana Tayin brought in a very important perspective that I think all of you have somehow spoken to, but it's the youth perspective. It's the youth angle on youth finding it extraordinarily difficult to trust. And I think, Reverend Taylor, you mentioned this in the very beginning when you were talking about some of the aspects, and it has been repeatedly somehow iterated in terms of the brokennesses of the relationships. But we do have a challenge with trust, especially given the bipartisanship, the polarization, etc. And I just wanted to give, as a way of also concluding, because respectful of your respective times, would you mind, Reverend Taylor, if I please give the floor to the to Rabbi Joe Potasnik, and then to Dr. Hussein, and then have you help us with bringing Khitamuhu Misk, the nicely conclusion to it, by also referring to what has been said before. So with your permission, Reverend Taylor, I'd like to ask Rabbi Joe to give his thoughts on what he's heard and the aspects of trust and brokenness, and what James identified in terms of it's not the person, it's not the particular dynamic, it is the fact that we have the brokenness in the relationships themselves, the oppression itself, rather than the people who oppress or are oppressed. Please, your thoughts.
Doctor, thank you so much. I just want to add one verse to the Beatitudes, which would be, blessed are those who speak briefly, for they shall be invited back. And I think we all qualify to be included. Let me say, I wish we could take this on the road, because I think people need to see those who have different perspectives, who look at life through different lenses, one lens being different and one lens being the same. Because I don't think they see enough of it. They see one or the other. They look at CNN or Fox, but they don't see where people are in an arena where they can share difference in a respectful fashion. I just want to conclude. My parents came to this country after the war. They lost their children during the Holocaust. I'm a product of their second marriage. Two groups reached out to them when they arrived. The Jews of the Jewish Center in Lynn, Massachusetts, and the nuns of St. Mary's Church in Lynn, Massachusetts. Now, why would the nuns reach out to people who were totally different? Because they didn't see them as totally different. They saw them as being not the other, but really part of all of us, not separate from us, a part of us. So I would just hope that if we want to teach trust, then we have to be trustworthy. You want to teach kids how to love, you got to be loving. We have to embody what we say. We have to be on the outside, what we say on the inside. I think the more we show people what the right configuration is of people who can be together and love each other, even though they may not like something that was being said, then we will make a major step forward. But we have to begin. You know, Yom Kippur is following Rosh Hashanah, and in it you have to ask for forgiveness. You have to go over to people and say, I'm sorry. Even if you think you were right, you have to say, I'm sorry. And I often thought to myself, what a major moment it would be if we get all the different communities to turn to one another and say, I committed some wrongs and I am sorry. And maybe when we commit our own failings, that maybe we would see fewer failings in others and more in ourselves and build more trust in one another.
Brilliant. Now you all know why this is my rabbi. Thank you very much, Rabbi Joe. Dr. Hussein, your thoughts and reflections, but also some of the points related to trust and have we lost our humanity and how do we build a beloved community together from an Islamic space in the United States? Thank you.
I have to think about, I'm going to start backwards. I have to think about the beloved community question because I'm familiar with the language in a civic religion sense, but I haven't really thought about it in a theological sense. I don't know. I mean, we talk about Muslim traditions, we talk about maslaha, the idea of a common good. But I don't know if that maps out neatly to the beloved community. Doesn't mean I'm opposed to it. It just means I need to think about it. I think what both Sana and James's comments point to something that I think we need to I would want to disentangle, which is interpersonal relationships and social/structural relationships. So when we talk about uh, broken relationships, 100% I agree. I think there's a huge element of lack of relationality, which is why I brought up sadaqah as being both giving and community, as well as trust and friendship. That there is that relationality that is broken, that is incredibly important. I think oppression is symptomatic of that. I don't think oppression, I think oppression must be stopped, but it has to come to the repair of relationality, and that comes through addressing, this is where justice language comes in, is that it is not up to the oppressed to figure out, to understand and accept the oppressor and say, yes, I understand where you're coming from, please continue to oppress me. And I'm not saying James is saying that, I want to be clear, I'm taking the framing in extremis to make the point. That I think that it is those of us who have the ability to say to the oppressor, there's a broken relationship here, you are doing oppression. And to repair the relationship is about ceding some of that power. That has to come, and I think this is where it connects with the question about trust, is that there have to be agents of trust that come in and speak to the oppressor and say, you know, wiping out a whole bunch of people, not a good idea. Let's not do that. And let's exercise some control here. Otherwise, that's not really a trust partner, right? That is a co-oppressor. Individually, I think trust has to be built up over time. That's the relationality, right? I like Reverend Adam Taylor and what he had to say today. I don't know him enough to trust him. Doesn't mean I won't go back and listen to him. Doesn't mean I'm not going to answer his phone call or his email. It just means I don't know him enough to trust him, that there is a relationship, but there's no relationality. And I think that that's really important. This is not a dig on you, Adam. I'm just, making the point. You know, think about the formation of the Avengers. They really didn't like each other until Coulson got killed, you know, and then they became a team. That's when they really came together in Crisis. I had to do it because you opened up that doorway. And so I think trust is really important, right? I think being a Gen X kid, being a Gen X kid who is Muslim and a person of color, there is a deep distrust of the United States government. We learn about COINTELPRO. We learn about law enforcement emerging out of the desire to keep people enslaved, right? That the earliest law enforcements were, in fact, slave patrols. We learn about surveillance of Muslim communities, that it becomes very hard to trust that the government is here for the best interest when you are not in power. And at the same time, there are individuals within government who I trust explicitly and implicitly. And what do we do when we don't have government support for retirement, or as measly as it is for education, right? That we also need the government to do good for us. So we can hold both these truths to be true, but really trust is something that has to be earned, is something that has to be particular. It's not a generic sense of being. And I think so we really have to distinguish between the interpersonal and the structural or social aspect of all of this.
Super. Thank you so much, Dr. Hussain. All right, Reverend Adam Taylor, if your job was complicated in the beginning, I think it's slightly more interesting and engaging, and a little bit more perhaps complicated now, but certainly I would like very much, please, and we're all honored for you to have the final word. Based on what you've heard, what do you want to leave us with? And yeah, what do you want to leave those who will hear this recording and haven't been able to participate with on building the beloved community and a more perfect union?
Well, first, honored to be a part of this conversation, and so much I want to respond to, but let me just share 3 quick things. I'm a Baptist, so we think in 3 points oftentimes, and it's not going to be a sermon, I promise. But the first is that the force and an allure of fear and hatred is quite powerful. And I think it's particularly prominent in our politics today. But I ultimately believe that the power of love, of empathy, of a commitment to the common good, and I'm a huge fan of the common good, I'm a big fan of Catholic social teaching, is even more powerful. And so in my faith tradition, I'm reminded of a text that says, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but has given us the power of love and of peace and of a sound mind. And so just kind of put forward the kind of power of love in this context. Second thing I would emphasize is kind of an altar call, if you will, and at least in the terminology of my faith tradition. I think one of the things that it's really essential we do as people of faith is really show up in this election, not just by voting, but really trying to ensure that we can protect everyone's freedom to vote. And one of our main initiatives is a campaign called Face United to Save Democracy. And it's a multi-faith campaign that's working in particular in 10 battleground states to try to ensure that everyone, particularly the most vulnerable voters, are able to vote freely, safely, etc. And now we've added a phase that will take us all the way through inauguration to ensure that we can have a kind of a safe process and a fair process all the way through that time frame. So an invitation for any of you that might be interested in serving is what we call a poll chaplain on election day. You can go to turnoutsunday.com and sign up for one of our trainings. The last thing I'll just say really quickly is that, one of my favorite quotes by Dr. King is from a sermon of his where he said, "The saving of our world from pending doom will come not through the complacent adjustment of a conforming majority, but through the creative maladjustment of a non-conforming minority." And I think at the crux of so many of our faith traditions is this kind of commitment to be creatively maladjusted to the brokenness and the injustice around us. But it's not just about having a different mindset, it's also about a commitment to action, a commitment to sacrifice in the face of that injustice. And I have been inspired by what a small, dedicated minority of people can do to transform our politics. And I still believe that is possible and still necessary. So I will end with that note of hope.
Thank you very much indeed. Reverend Adam Taylor, Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, Dr. Hossein Rashid, thank you so much. Thank you to all those who have been engaged with us in this cozy conversation that has been incredibly enlightening, I think. And at a minimum, I just want to repeat and iterate that what Rabbi Potasnik said is this kind of a conversation would be great to take on the road and to continue to expand the circle of solidarity. I haven't heard that word from any of you, but I do think it is a very, very critical concept that we've kind of lost since the 80s and 90s, and nobody talks about solidarity anymore. And yet, everything you've all said in terms of rebuilding trust, in terms of the challenge to ourselves, if it's not about the oppressor, but the oppression, that these are all very important aspects of the poetics of solidarity that we in fact need to engage and revive as part of this very critical project of building a beloved community. And I think one of the things that I've felt as you've all been speaking and engaging is that we have a great deal more in common than we actually have in differences. And even at the height of moments of pain and inflicting of pain, there is actually plenty in common, but we overlook it because we're so busy looking at us and them and focusing on the polarization when we've forgotten that we have, all of us share, and that's the point that Nalida was also elaborating. We share plenty, much more than we do, even when we disagree violently. There's actually more being shared than less that is broken. So maybe on that thought, I want to thank you all and thank you for joining this Lead Integrity Leadership conversation. Till the next one, stay blessed, stay safe, and thank you ever so much to all of you. Bye-bye. Great, thank you.